In the last video, I explained the ways in which Zwingli is kind of a continuation of Luther's teachings, and also how Zwingli's Reformation takes place in Switzerland, and how this Reformation that's led by Zwingli's religious ideas uses political power to enforce this Reformation, and that this use of political power is aligned with political interests in Switzerland at the time that lean towards independence. And so becoming a Protestant or embracing Zwingli's ideas, these are seen as ways of distinguishing Switzerland, of establishing Switzerland as independent from France and independent from the Holy Roman Empire. And so the political inclinations of Switzerland align with the religious direction that Zwingli is going, and they're enforced by political power. And so we talked about religious aspects, we talked about political aspects, social aspects. The whole social fabric of this society is being changed at this time. So this is going to lead to a lot of instability. Now we're going to move on to some other radical Protestant groups. We're going to talk a little bit about the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists represent another change in approach to Christianity that comes out of the Protestant Reformation. Up until the Reformation, the idea is that everyone's kind of thrown together, sinners and saints. Everyone commits sins, but it's possible for those sins to be forgiven through penance and through the grace of the church. And what we see with the Anabaptists is kind of a rejection of that sacramental power. Just in the same way that Luther had said you don't need a priest to forgive your sins, with the Anabaptists, it's more in terms of a predestination argument. There are those who are saved and those who are damned to hell, and the sacraments of the church don't make a difference one way or the other. And so with the Anabaptists, we're going to see this interest in living in communities of the saved. But paradoxically, how do you know that people are saved? You know they're saved through their works. So we're going to kind of come back to works. Works are the ways that you know that someone is saved. They don't make you saved. They're just a sign that you're saved. But without this opportunity for penance and forgiveness that had existed prior to the Reformation. And so this means that in many ways, although people today often talk about the Reformation in terms of freedom of the individuals, we see with the Anabaptists that sometimes these Protestant communities can be far more totalitarian than the Catholic communities that they replaced, or the Catholic structures and hierarchies that they replaced. Now, the reason that Zwingli is so important, even though he dies so quickly, is that he establishes this radical form of Protestantism in Switzerland. And it's a foundation that other reformers will build from. And this is true of the Anabaptists as well. Some of the early Anabaptists had participated in Zwingli's cookout, in Zwingli's initial rebellion. And so they were a part of this radical Protestant group. And then around 1522, right around the time the bishop is expelled from the city, they start to meet together in groups to study the Bible independently. And the leader of this group is a man named Conrad Grebel, who you see depicted here. And Grebel came from a wealthy family. He was educated in a Renaissance humanist education in Vienna and in Paris, and he returned to Zurich and became a very close friend and follower of Zwingli, partly through their shared interest in the study of languages, shared interest in the study of the Hebrew and Greek of the Bible. And so this is again a sign of where the Reformation is consistent with the Renaissance and is in continuity with the Renaissance. This interest in language is carried over into the Reformation. However, Grebel becomes convinced that Zwingli is more interested in political power than in honestly and genuinely pursuing religious reform. So Grebel wanted to move very quickly to implement these more radical Protestant teachings. Zwingli wanted to move quickly, but he wanted to move a little more slowly. For Zwingli, it's important to maintain the hierarchy of the city council on his side. They're providing the taxes, the revenue, the political power that he needs to carry this out. Grebel wants a more radical approach. Grebel wants to just go right in there and even get rid of the hierarchy of the city government. And this is going to be one of the distinctions with the Anabaptists that makes them one of the more radical groups. They don't just want to use political hierarchies to remove religious hierarchies. They want to remove both political and religious hierarchies and totally replace the hierarchical structure of this society with autonomous groups of individuals reading the scriptures. And so as this happens, Grebel and Zwingli start to grow apart and even in opposition to one another. And so Grebel and the Anabaptists start to develop teachings that are going to lead them into conflict with Zwingli. And it just shows you how quickly all this is taking place, that we've moved from a Catholic structure very, very quickly to divisions even within Protestant structures. So why is it that the Anabaptist teachings are going to lead them into controversy and conflict? Firstly, that the Anabaptists are politically exclusive. They acknowledge they belong to their own group, their own religious circle, but they don't acknowledge any social or political ties outside of that. In fact, they read the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospels as a call to form a separate society of truly believing Christians. And because they reject any other social and political ties, they don't say they belong to a particular neighborhood, they don't say they belong to a particular city, they refuse military service. This is especially problematic in Switzerland. Switzerland, small country, kind of in the middle of some larger kingdoms, fighting for its independence. The idea is that when there's a war, everyone in the community will fight to defend the independence of the particular city in Switzerland or Switzerland itself. And so their refusal to take up arms is very much a way in which they're renouncing their citizenship in this society. They also refuse to take oaths. This is also a big deal in a pre-modern society. Those of you who have taken classes on medieval history, you'll remember that oaths and someone's word sworn on the Bible, these were the bonds that were used to reforge this society after the fall of the Roman Empire. That at least you have some kind of contract that people will respect. For the Anabaptists, this is a type of blasphemy for demanding oaths and swearing on the Bible in these circumstances, and so they refuse to participate. Then this is another way of renouncing their citizenship or their participation in this society. They're saying they're not going to be bound by the bonds that have made this society work for a number of centuries. And so they're setting themselves up to be distrusted. They also refuse to pay tithes or interest. So this means paying interest on any loans. That's probably pretty familiar to people. Refusing to pay tithes. This means refusing to pay a portion of your tax to the church, which was the practice at the time. There was a tax burden that went to political leaders, the political state. There was a tax burden that went to the church. That was called a tithe, and Anabaptists refused to pay that. And this is a big deal for Zwingli because this means he's relying on these funds to fund the armies that he's raising to defend and promote his Reformation. And so all of these actions on the part of the Anabaptists separate them from Zwingli and mark them out as different and as a threat in this society. But the most prominent point of contention of all was a theological question. And so we're talking about, in this part of the class where we look at the Reformation, we're talking about religious and political motives and how they intersect. And sometimes people want to say it's totally religious. Some people want to say it's totally political. This shows you more of the religious side of things. I think the Anabaptists very much show you that it's a mixture, but that religion is really important. People today tend to think that religion is always just this veneer that people don't really believe and don't really take seriously, and people are mostly motivated by political differences. But with the Anabaptists, and when we look at this episode in history, we can see that the main reason why the Anabaptists are distrusted by Zwingli and come into conflict with Zwingli are their teachings on baptism. So now we have to get into a little bit of the history of the interpretation of the ritual of baptism. So Augustine of Hippo, one of the very earliest teachers and great interpreters of church teaching, had taught that baptism erases original sin. We talked about what original sin was a couple of weeks back, and enables human beings to receive God's grace in order to be saved. So human being is in a state of original sin. They can't receive the grace of God. They can't go to heaven. Baptism washes away original sin and makes it possible for them to receive God's grace. Luther said the sacraments are a sign and a promise. God doesn't need this ritual of baptism in order to save an individual, but this is a sign of the grace that God will give to the soul that believes. Zwingli goes even further and says this is only a sign. It's just a symbol of what God does in God's own time. And so for Zwingli, baptism is not a sacrament that changes the soul of the human individual. Baptism is just an initiation ceremony and a pledge to lead a life of discipleship. But grace in the soul, the grace that's necessary to save the soul, isn't activated until later when the individual makes an act of faith. So this is where Zwingli and Luther are aligned. Remember, only faith saves. So the Anabaptists are going to take this and they're going to say, if that's the case, then baptizing infants doesn't make any sense. Why would you baptize someone who is not going to be saved until they can make an act of faith? And so the Anabaptists are going to reject infant baptism. They say we find no evidence in the Bible of the apostles baptizing infants. And this practice is just a perversion of the Roman Catholic Church that they introduced to make sure they had control over people through their ceremonies right from the very beginning. And so they propose that instead, baptism is more like a confession of faith. It's an act that a believer should perform when they are old enough and mature enough to make an act of belief and that they can be saved. However, to Luther and Zwingli, this sounded like saying that this act of faith, this ceremony, this confession of faith and baptism is a human saving themselves. But only God, remember, only God can save individuals. So this is why this becomes a huge point of conflict. For the Anabaptists, infant baptism is something that the individual Christian can't assent to through faith, and so it's just a tool of control. For Luther and Zwingli, waiting for adult baptism suggests that the human being is in some way saving themselves, which is deeply problematic for them. And so what happens in Switzerland? The Anabaptists begin to baptize one another. They begin to re-baptize themselves as adults, and they say this is the legitimate baptism. There's a debate between Grebel and Zwingli. Zwingli dominates. Remember, Zwingli always wins the debate. And the city council, and here we see political power entering into the equation again. The city council orders that all unbaptized infants must be baptized, and any unauthorized preaching is forbidden. And the Anabaptists continue to rebaptize. They do this in defiance of Zwingli, and they begin preaching against Zwingli in the streets and even referring to him as the Antichrist. Remember, of course, Zwingli is worried at this time about the Catholic cantons that are about to attack. There's about to be a war. He needs the city of Zurich on his side. He cracks down very harshly on the Anabaptists. Those who are not from the city of Zurich are banished. Those who are imprisoned and tortured and even executed. Grebel dies of the plague in 1526, and those who continue to rebaptize infants are punished through execution.